Tonight, I'm going to talk about going in search of the commoners. Mostly this idea comes from, and you'll see in a little bit, about an image of this idea that the graves that we're finding from the Xiongnu Empire, you have big graves, these are the elites, and the small graves, these are the commoners. But it's much more complicated than that. As far as we understand, some of these smaller graves are actually of local leaders, maybe powerful families within the different valleys, which then begs the question, if those aren't the commoners, where are the commoners? So what can we look at through archaeology and through history documents? In what way can we get at this issue of the commoners, the other lowest level of society that existed? We may not have everything that we need to look at them, but at least we should start thinking about them. They should be in the equation when we think about the entire society that existed in this first nomadic empire. So the first bit, I'm sort of going to go through all the textual information that's out there. Now a lot of these texts are from court histories that were written in the Chinese court, and they have certain agendas of their own. But there are several other types of documents that I'll get to in a little bit that might actually get a little bit closer to what's happening on the ground in the frontier garrisons and other places. But this is a nice one because it reminds us of the idea that, especially from the Chinese perspective, that they had this idea that everybody is the same, all up there, from the lords and the kings on down, all the way down to the tiniest little household family in the steppe. They were all eating the same kind of thing, dressing the same way in felt and fur. The idea of they all have the same lifeways. And we know this probably wasn't true. They had different types of lifeways. Some people maybe didn't have nice fur coats, badger or whatever. But at least this is sort of the launching point that we should start from. We have other descriptions. This is yet another text that's not used as much but is actually better. There's these ideas that they all live in the same kind of nomadic tents. They're always moving around constantly. But the best part I like about this text is this part. The meeting places and the markets move about. That even if you have some settlements, parts of the people within the Xiongnu Empire may have been settled into little pit house villages all over the place, that a lot of these meeting places, even though they're fixed, the structures that we see now in the steppe are fixed, people may have been coming and going to these places a lot. And this is the closest that we can get. This image is from a birch bark container, and it has pictures of the closest images we can get to what the ger looked like at that time, with interwoven wooden pieces, these strange little caps that appear again and again. And the little bit of Chinese text that we have talk about the fact that these are, the text here says willow, but we don't really know if it's actually willow tree or what kind of tree it was. But that it was interwoven branches in a very lattice type fashion, that their coverings on the wall and over the dome of the tent was with felt. And this is nice because it hasn't changed that much. But this is the point of this other image. Here, this is from the Minnesink Basin, sort of an area at the edge of the Xiongnu Empire. And this is a nice one because here's a ger, but these are not. These are permanent wooden structures. And one of my colleagues, Peter Hummel actually, is working in the Minnesink Basin right now on this time period, and they are finding little settlements with permanent wooden houses in there. And the last one I wanted to leave it with is to come back to this quote of everybody lives the same way, they're all treated the same way, and this is the first inkling that we have that it's not all that way. This one presents the idea that the people in the steppe didn't have family names. They didn't have established lineages that you would know from the grandfather to the father, actual family names. But we know that's not true because some of the big rulers and the main powerful families within the Xiongnu Empire did have family names, and we know them. But I think what's more important here is the idea that some of the most powerful people were established families. They had names, they had lineages that they knew of for generations and generations. And these would have been the more established people within the different valleys. When we start to think down to all the general populace below and controlled by these, whether it's the rulers or just like local powerful families, there's the idea that the entire society can be mobilized. Everyone is a warrior. They start to ride sheep from when they're a small child. And the point is that all society, all men can be mobilized to be for these big armies. And what are the armies used for? The Chinese texts give us an idea of all these huge armies that are going down to the frontier and raiding and big campaigns, perhaps in the very beginning of the establishment of the empire. But what happens afterwards? When they go down to the frontiers, one of the most important things to think about in trying to step back from the assumptions that a lot of historians have about these nomadic societies, or I should say these steppe pastoral societies, is that they were dependent on grains. You cannot have a diet of just milk and meat. That's not possible. So they must have been raiding China to get all the grain. But when they go down to China, they never take grain. Never. They only take animals and people and people and people. People is the most important thing for these massive raiding parties to take. And what ends up happening is, this is a description of what happens when the Xiongnu Empire starts to fall apart. There are so many of these captive people that are around in the society that there actually is a word for slave within the Xiongnu society. And there's so many of them that as the empire starts to dissolve, they band together and create their own groups. This particular group goes from the steppe all the way down into the Gansu corridor, gives itself a name, gives itself a chieftain. Suddenly you start to see lineages or powerful families coming about. So there were clearly a lot of these captive groups. But where are their graves? Where are their settlements? We don't really know. So when we think about these raiding parties, these are documents from these Chinese fortresses that sat on the border between the Chinese realms and the Mongolian or the Xiongnu realms at the time. And they're a nice set of documents to look at because they remind us of it's not always these huge, big armies from the Xiongnu emperors or the Xiongnu kings coming down. They're really small raiding parties. Here it's just maybe 100 people. In this case, it was only 20 people who came. And this little story is nice because here it is, one Chinese official goes out on his own and 4 people are hiding in the river. They jump out and then push him one direction. Then next thing you know, 2 other mounted warriors come out from behind him and capture him and take him away. They're capturing people, they're capturing animals, anything they can. But here it is, it's really, really small. So even though we had the idea that much of society was trained to be warriors and could be mobilized for these huge armies, they were also acting on their own on a lot of times. And the vast majority, I think, of what was happening after these big conquests was these small parties acting on their own. When we also look at the frontier documents, rather than envisioning this idea of the Xiongnu were dependent on places like China for grain and silk was the only thing going up, that's sort of the narrative that you get when you look at general historical descriptions of the Xiongnu. But in reality, they had a lot of highly valued products on their own. The sort of accounts of the marketplaces and gifting that was happening in these frontier markets includes all sorts of felt, of woven. Here it's called a hul, which is another word for the Xiongnu northern people. They had their own textiles that they were weaving. They were colored with different things, oranges, purples, reds, all these other things. There were a lot of products that were being made en masse within the steppe. And so we have to think about what was happening in the Xiongnu Empire to have large-scale production of these woven textiles, of felt, of dyeing them, of raising huge amounts of horses and cattle to trade downward into other areas. Which begs the question of, if you have a lot of these large-scale production that's happening, who's doing all this stuff? Who's managing it? There are only certain times of year, sometimes where you can really get all the milk products you want, or certain times of year where you need to get all the wool from the sheep. So just as you would probably need a lot of people to be harvesting crops from an agricultural field in a heavily agricultural society, we should also be thinking about when and how for these short periods of time, you might need to harvest the wool, harvest the milk, harvest the tall grass, the fodder for the winter. These also would require large labor pools of people, and that may have been some of the uses of all these captive people that were taken. So the idea that the Xiongnu may have gone down and captured all these people because, they needed people to make their own crafts, or they needed people to plow their fields for them, as if the people within the steppe did not know how to plow fields or did not know how to make their own craft work or anything, has to sort of go out the window. It's only a question of the scale of production, I think, is what's really happening with capturing the people. So we come back to, I come now to burials, which is the vast majority of archaeological materials for the Xiongnu Empire is actually coming from graves. There are a lot of, or more recently, there's some projects to do field surveys to look at, scatters of sherds to see where the campsites are. There's now excavations on some of these big walled structures to see what's inside there and what activities are happening there. But the vast majority of archaeology that we have for the Xiongnu is still from the graves. And so this is where I come back to this concept of the really big ones were supposed to be for the elites. And the normal ones, which are scattered all over the realms of the empire, these are the commoners. And what I've been trying to argue instead is that these are the uppermost elites, the sort of royal people tied directly to the ruling lineages. And these are not commoners, but more likely common elites, the local families that are in power. When you look at the distribution and the sizes of these graves, you see that there's an overlap between the smallest of the big square tombs and the largest of the circular graves. That there's a lot to do with showing how powerful you are to have a big grave with lots of stuff, but there's some sort of cutoff happening here where only the people who are tied in a certain way to the ruling lineages are allowed to have these square tombs. And there's, I think, something that can be taken from the Chinese texts where they make a difference between the noble stock, or like the families and lineages, and all those other people. And in here, they're not talking about just any old family across the steppe. They're talking about all these other powerful families that may, hold sway in different regions, but they are not part of the accepted royal lineages who have certain privileges and are allowed to do certain things. So when we look at what's inside these ring graves, these commoners, or should I say common elites, we see a lot of things. Some sometimes pots, but sometimes really nice bronze cauldrons. You may have really fancy belt pieces with gold and whatever, but even some of the lesser ones, like this one that we found in Hovd, if you look closely, it's 2 pieces of gold just sort of slapped on there. This is not something super fancy like this. But some of these, somewhat lesser local elite families are trying their best to imitate what the bigger elites are doing. They're trying their best. And from the cemetery that this was from out in Hovd, there are no big forests out there. But still, some of the graves had coffins that were clearly cut from pieces of really big tree trunks. Where are they getting these from? They must have been imported. And to import big pieces of wood to make a wood plank coffin like this one, which is coming from Transbaikal, which has plenty of trees all over the place, must have been a serious cost. And even some of the graves at this site in West Mongolia, they would take little pieces of wood, probably from the little tiny trees or bushes or whatever, and then take some of the branches, and they interwove them so tightly to try their best to imitate the standard wooden coffins that the big people in the elite cemeteries in the center of the empire were doing. They were trying their best to be just like them. But the most important thing besides, whether it's imported Chinese lacquer vessels or anything else, the most important thing to look at in these big ring graves was the sacrifice of animals. Because it's not just the idea of, oh, if there's animals in the grave, yes, these are pastoral herders, so of course they have animals in the grave. That's a huge sacrifice, to be killing animals from your herd just for the burial of a person. Which is why when we start looking at some of the really, really small graves, we're not seeing these sacrifices. These wouldn't be necessarily the herds of the person that died. It's more an issue of the people that attend the ceremony sacrifice an animal from their herd and give it in honor of the deceased. So the fact that you would have this many animals killed speaks to how many people were coming together to honor this one individual and how important that individual had been to the community and all the connections therein. But let's start looking at the commoners now. When you go to cemeteries, this is one example of a project in Bakazar and Cholo where they started to try and look at everything, not just the nice big rings, but the really small ones, to start asking the question, what about these tiny ones? What's in those? And they found there's no wood coffin, there's no stone coffin, just a pit, barely anything. This one is completely looted, but even the looted ones, like the grave I showed before, you can still see the coffin is there. You still see the animals are there. The looting was going after the belt pieces and the necklace. But these are really small and really simple. But what would these people be doing in a cemetery with all the other powerful like families with nice Chinese goods and imported stuff? And this one especially we'll come back to. There's only one cemetery in Mongolia of the Xiongnu period that was completely excavated. And this is a nice little window into not just genetic relationship between all the people in the cemetery, but a lot of things of, okay, what's the full spectrum of people in that valley that were important? This is the largest cemetery in that particular valley. And there are many other smaller cemeteries, but in this one, it's interesting because all the graves that had no wooden coffin, not as much, they're all sort of put aside to one little area. But when you look at some of the genetics that was done a long time ago, even though some of these methods have been questioning and they're going back and trying to revise it, it at least shows you that these are not, they're somewhat related. These are not random slaves that are taken from the Chinese border and brought in. They're related enough genetically to be somewhat from this area, from this region. Who they were and how they got to be in a cemetery with other people that have broken Chinese mirrors and golden beads and other things is another question. So when our project with the National Museum went out to far west Mongolia to look at one of these square tomb cemeteries, the goal was actually not to look at what's inside the big tombs, but to look at what's next to the big tombs. Who are these people that they have almost no burial offerings? They seem to be really, really meager. How do they get to be in a cemetery of either big elites, such as this one, or even just the common elite graves? And so we took a method that has been adopted since, but by an archaeologist in Buryatia many decades ago. He was the first one who said, let's look outside this big tomb. I mean, he ended up digging this, but he cleared away the whole area around it, and he found all these little fire pits that appear to be at the same level as the burials. He didn't radiocarbon date them, which would have been nice, but it wouldn't surprise me if these fires were related to the rituals at this site. But what he did find was these tiny little satellite graves. In this case, these had nice wooden coffins with the sort of standard ring grave that you would see in a cemetery that didn't have these big square tombs. This is an example of, this is actually the largest Xiongnu tomb ever found. It has tons of these satellite graves here. And the idea that these are commoners suddenly goes out the window when you look at some of the things, especially in here. They had tons of equipment. And these are still heavily, heavily looted graves. And yet still they have lots of nice things. These are very important people associated with this person somehow. What that association is, we're not really sure. There's only a tiny little mention in the Chinese documents that when this ruler died, when any sort of noble person died, that the people associated with him or her would follow that person in death. Now, whether they were just like sacrificed and thrown somewhere else, we don't know. Whether they were actually buried next to the person in this sort of relationship here seems somewhat plausible. But again, we have to be very, very wary of our assumptions. So when we went out to Takhiltyn Khotgor, we dug up the one square tomb. We wanted to do the whole complex to see the relationship between the person in the tomb and these little tiny things next to it. So this is a map of the whole cemetery. You can see there are, again, way out on the frontier, the western frontier of the empire, which is another reason we went out there. We didn't want to see what's happening right in the center. We want to know what's happening when an empire pushes out to these new frontiers and they try and establish control over them. You see the same kind of thing where you got little satellite graves and some circle graves, some square graves. So we cleared out this whole thing. We found these stone lines with burnt bone offerings. That's another paper altogether. But then we found one ring grave. When we were mapping it, we registered it as one square tomb, one ring grave. That was it. It was the only circle. This tiny little pile of stones, we thought, okay, let's clear it out. Let's see. Is it a dog that got buried, maybe an extra animal or something? What was inside the tomb is really, really normal, exactly what you would see in the center of the empire. So clearly, this way peripheral elite was tied directly into all the traditions and all the networks of the ruling factions. But here was not like a dog or a horse or something. It was an actual human burial. But the beauty of it is it was unlooted. It was undisturbed. So suddenly we had to start thinking about there's possibly a whole category of burials that's not the square, not the ring like everybody talks about, but just a little pile of stones sitting on top. And what was inside, because it was unlooted, it's really nice. We get to see the whole collection of what would have been there. There was nothing. She was just wrapped in normal clothing, no gold, no fancy beads, absolutely nothing. And especially by the late period, Xiongnu, which is what these graves are from, the normal custom is to bury just like this, completely stretched. Oop, I just turned it off. There we go. Completely in the stretched fashion. I give this picture because this is a local tradition way out in the Altai regions of burying the people somewhat flexed like this. Why this person is partially flexed is another issue. They may have been other groups that were there that were holding on to their local traditions, and now they get to be buried. How they get to be buried in association with this person, we don't know. Was it a slave person? Was it, simply, an intermarriage? We have no idea. But there's something happening here where these really, really, really small graves get put into these large cemeteries. And the only way that we're finding them is because we see these on the surface. So we go to the place. We start digging everything up. But what would happen if you went all across the steppe and saw a little pile of stones and dig it up? Maybe you dig up an oval or something. And then we come back to this one. This one was looted. And when you look at where the ring is, the grave isn't right in the middle of the ring where it would normally be. It's sort of put aside. And what we were postulating was that this was actually never a ring because it's not many stones. But in the process of looting it, they throw it aside. And because we go to these sites assuming that there's only two categories, it's a square or it's a ring, we reconstruct it, it must have been a ring. And so when we go back to some of these other sites, such as this, where the grave pit is put aside from where the stones are, there may be a whole category of these graves of just a little pile of stones here, 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 that we've never even thought about as being a grave and probably paid no attention to at all. Inside these tiny little graves that flanked it, we find nothing, no gold. This is a simple little bone belt piece. And in this one, all of these are unlooted completely. And so we get to see this idea that there's a whole category of graves of just a little tiny pile of stones put on top of the burial. And underneath, what we find, this example here, again, mostly bone pieces. A little pipe thing that may have been like a brush for brushing, I don't think it's teeth, but maybe. Ankle bones, an iron knife, very, very simple things. This is not what I would call elite, but it's perhaps getting closer to this other lower echelon that would resemble the commoners. Now this person, people such as this, may not have been like the real run-of-the-mill commoners, because somehow he was privileged, and in this case a he, was privileged enough to be buried in a cemetery that was only reserved for the ruling elites that were tied to the families that ruled the entire empire. We don't know how this person got in there, but they did. But at least it makes us think again about what all these tiny little, other peoples, how they would have been buried. And so in this case, these are actually from a cemetery in Buryatia where there was no surface marking whatsoever. They only found the cemetery because they cleared off a huge area that was next to a pit house village, and then they found an entire cemetery. So when we went up to the next part of the project, we went way, way up into the mountains, into an area of the Altai Mountains that was the major passage through from the western edge of Mongolia down into the area of what is now Xinjiang. And sure enough, there's a Xiongnu cemetery up in there. This is a really, really important passage, so of course they would have been having a nice elite cemetery in there, and we found, the typical ring graves. And here it's a little hard to see the color differentiation, but so the brown ones here and here and here and here, these are all graves, like nice big ring graves with wooden coffins. Again, you have some of these. These are huge planks of wood coming from trees that do not exist in this part of the country. So how they got a hold of them, I don't know. You have little fragments of imported Chinese lacquer, gold beads. All these are nice things. But what happens when you look at the little tiny ones here and here and here? We were very fortunate to have a lot of unlooted graves. This may be an effect of us trying specifically to look at the smallest graves possible we could find there. Ones that at the time of looting, which happened during the time of the Xiongnu Empire and sometimes immediately after, they knew what they were doing. They knew exactly where to go, how to loot it, pop back out. So they knew that there would be nothing in here. We find a whole set of people whereas in some of the, in some of the nice big wooden coffins, you would have this sun and moon emblem nailed to the coffin. In the little lesser ones, they take a little piece of iron and just sort of stick it in there, because you can't exactly nail it to a piece of stone. And the other nice thing is now we get an idea of when we come back to the very, very beginning, this idea that the whole society was mobilized, all these mounted warriors, well, what did they look like? What are the regular people, not the big elites with their big gold belt plaques or bronze belt plaques? What are the regular mounted so-called warriors looking like? And this one and another one I'll show you is the best idea that we can get. And strange enough, it actually matches a lot of what the Chinese documents were talking about. They wielded spears, knives and daggers, and bow and arrow. So here we find the head of an iron spear, and this is a set of iron arrowheads. You got small ones, big ones. There's even actually a bone one right here. And then here and here and here are the pieces of the composite bow. So here again we see the same kind of thing. A pile of stones that is only just big enough to cover the pit that sits on top of the actual grave itself. Not a huge ring with this sort of center pit in there. And here we see again this sort of the set of arrowheads, which is, we jokingly called it the set of golf clubs, because it has every single kind you can imagine. The big ones, the small ones. There's a certain kind of arrowhead that comes to a point this way that may have been for drilling into, for warfare. The really small ones that may have just been used for hunting, don't know. Here's a reconstruction just for the non-archaeologists out there. The composite bow at this time was a fantastic technology because it put these bone pieces onto the ends to strengthen it. So when we get back to how we can try and find out about the commoners and what we can do to find out more about them, one of the graves that we dug at this cemetery One of the tiny little piles of stones ended up being something completely natural, perhaps a little pile of stones like an oval, or we have no idea. We dug it up and we said, well, that's not a grave. But we have to keep looking at all these little things that may be something. And no, we can't go throughout the steppe and just dig up every little pile of stones we see, but sometimes if you dig up something, even if it's a pile of dirt, you may find something that you never expected to. So when we think about the Xiongnu Empire, I think even if we can't really get lots of information, data archaeologically or textually about the real commoners, not just the common elites, but the real commoners of the society, it at least has to be in our minds when we're reconstructing it. And we have to accept the fact that we may not have the full spectrum of everybody in that society, all their remains and stuff. Thank you.